Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I'm SocietySucks and today I'm checking out why did the 1945 Japanese army coup against the emperor fail by History Matters. Now I didn't know that there was a coup against the emperor of Japan, but I guess it also kind of makes sense because I think the Japanese were all about like death before dishonor, some shit like that. Like the kamikaze pilots, they would rather die for their country than live. It's messed up. But yeah, that's what they were like, as far as I know, so I guess it does make sense. Let's see why it failed.
When Japan surrendered on the 15th of August 1945, not everybody there was happy about it. Well, nobody was exactly happy about losing the war, but there were some there who were even less pleased about the surrender and the great feelings of shame that came with it. In fact, when talks of surrender picked up pace in early August, some officers within the army took it upon themselves to overthrow the government, and install a hardline one which would continue the war. However, this coup went terribly. And within the space of a day it had failed. The emperor had broadcast his speech announcing Japan's unconditional surrender, and those who would try to prevent it were inconvenienced. But given how strong Japanese feelings towards surrender were, why did the coup aimed at keeping Japan fighting fail? Why couldn't it stop the emperor from giving in to the Allies? So, as you'll know, by July 1945 things weren't exactly going great for Japan. The Philippines had just been liberated by the United States, the remnants of its navy were doing poorly, and most importantly, the Italians had just declared war. Now, there were very few people in Japan who believed that this war would end in anything other than complete and utter defeat. The major disagreements were about what this defeat would look like exactly and what would become of Japan afterwards. The Allies helpfully cleared this up when they issued the Potsdam Declaration, in which the United States, Britain and China made clear the terms of surrender that they would accept. Unconditional. Obviously, for many in both the Japanese government and the military, this was unthinkable.
Yeah, when you tell people that the only option is unconditional surrender, that usually doesn't go well.
That Japan itself would be occupied by foreign powers who hadn't earned the right by at least conquering it was obscene. One of the most famous points in Japanese history was its repelling of the invasion by the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan. And so to give up without even trying to resist an American invasion was seen as unthinkable and as a betrayal of Japan's national honour. Not to mention that the Japanese army were fully aware that the Germans had fought to the bitter end, and that the Italians had at least waited until the Allies had landed on the mainland before throwing in the towel and joining them. Alongside this, the status of the emperor, or more broadly the monarchy and the imperial institution itself, was undefined. The Japanese wanted guarantees that the emperor, or at the very least his heirs, would remain on the throne. They went to the Soviets as intermediaries who told them to go away, and said that if Moscow's allies demanded unconditional surrender, then unconditional surrender it would have to be. And so, for the vast majority of the Japanese who revered the emperor, this was seen as a step too far. Meaning that resistance to the idea of surrender increased massively, because nobody wanted to be the ones in charge when the 2,500-year-old monarchy came to an end. As you'll probably guess,
I guess that does make sense.
At the time was torn on what to do in response to the Allied demand for surrender. On the one hand, they all knew that victory was impossible, but on the other hand, if
they knew they were doomed.
Surely it should be as costly for their enemy as humanly possible. This fierce divide led to very heightened tensions within the halls of power. For example, Kantaro Suzuki, the Prime Minister, was desperately pushing for peace and believed that this moment was Japan's best. Churchill had just been kicked out of office, the Soviets were still neutral, and there was enough of a military left to make continuing the war a costly endeavour. Whereas Koroichi Kurenami, the War Minister, believed that the Allied terms were far too harsh. And he argued that the Germany that Japan had allied with had been completely eradicated, and that such a fate couldn't be allowed to befall Japan. Furthermore, the military that he represented believed that surrender came after occupation and not before. And in the middle was Shigenori Togo, the foreign minister.
Yeah, you know, surrender can come before occupation, before your population has to suffer.
Who believed that the Allies would be flexible on the harsher points once Japan had actually surrendered. His immediate concern, though, was the Japanese people revolting if they learned what the terms of surrender were, and so he convinced the cabinet to publish the Potsdam Declaration, minus the bits about unconditional surrender, disarming Japan, and the whole trials for war criminals bits because they made them nervous. The government's response to the Allied demand for surrender was
made a lot of crimes.
That is, no comment.
Especially in China.
The government saw this response as, give us a minute whilst we think of what to do, but the Allies saw it as, that's so dumb we're not even going to dignify it with a response. Which, to nobody's surprise, angered the Allies and in turn led to Harry Truman authorising the use of atomic weapons against the Japanese to see if that would convince them. A little over a week later, both Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed, and to make matters even worse, the Soviet Union declared war, citing the complete lack of attempt by the Japanese to make peace. These two things combined spurred the Japanese government into action and would make surrender the obvious next choice, but fun fact, no. You see, the military and some of the cabinet believed that the Allies probably didn't have any more nuclear weapons, and that the demands for unconditional surrender were
They've already dropped 2. I think they had 5 prepared in total, and they could just make more over time. Like, the Japanese were never gonna win a fight that would last long, and the more time it takes, the more time the US would have to create more nukes, which could be later dropped on Japan. That's just a stupid argument saying, oh, they don't have any more nukes. Yeah, even if they didn't, they could always just make more.
Actually a clever ruse to hide their own weakness, and that if Japan would simply hold out, the Allies would soon back down. As a result, they accepted surrender, but on the following conditions. First, that the Emperor remain on the throne. Second, that Japan would oversee its own disarmament. Third, that the home islands wouldn't be occupied. And fourth, that there would be no trials for war criminals. Suzuki and those on his side pushed for just maintaining the Emperor bit, which Hirohito agreed to and they let the United States know. The Allies promptly rejected it, because that's not what unconditional means. The Allied rejection set off alarm bells across the army, and many of its officers now believe that the Allies would seek to dominate Japan and make it an American puppet republic. As such, some mid-ranking officers started to move troops into Tokyo, since they believed that only a coup could now stop the surrender. And whilst a coup against the Emperor might seem like an extreme reaction, it's important to note that there was precedent for what they were doing. The 1930s were a tumultuous time for Japan, with the army, the navy, the civilian government and the Emperor all vying for power. And during this, things got out of hand. Hardliners in the army and the navy attempted numerous coups against the government to secure their respective control over the country. But these coups failed every single time, mostly due to the fact that the army, or at least the rest of it, wasn't on board. Now, you'd be forgiven for expecting
so what makes them think this one's going to work?
These coup attempts would be punished severely. But you'd be mostly wrong. The vast majority of those involved were barely punished at all. In fact, when their motives of hyper-nationalist, imperialistic, emperor-worshipping militarism became clear, the public seemed to agree. Also, by routinely stopping the coups against the emperor, the army's role in government became much more prominent, meaning that they kind of got what they wanted anyway. Going back to 1945, Major Kenji Hatanaka, the coup's leader, asked Minister Anami if he would join them in their little coup, to which he said nothing. But also, he didn't turn them in or try to dissuade them from doing anything, which they took as a green light. Over the following days, the plotters moved some more of their troops into Tokyo and finalized
I guess he didn't say no.
The plan was to first seize the Imperial Palace and to capture the Emperor. If the Emperor wanted to surrender, then having his support would guarantee success. And if not, then he was either too weak or perhaps not mentally well enough to remain in place. And so his son, who would be young enough to make a puppet out of, would be elevated in his stead. After this, the Prime Minister and anyone against continuing the war would be sent to the next life. And once this was done, the rest of the army would inevitably join them, thus meaning that Japan was free to continue fighting a losing war at unimaginable cost.
And
anyway,
all
on the
die.
14th of August, the Prime Minister called an Imperial Conference, basically a fancier war council to press for the acceptance of surrender. It was here that Emperor Hirohito personally broke the deadlock and agreed to unconditional surrender. Now, the Emperor's intervention is often presented as an incredibly rare act, the idea being that the Emperor was supposed to be a silent observer at the war councils. However, this wasn't the case. Over the course of the war, he routinely made note of how Japan's glorious victories were getting closer and closer to home. However, Hirohito knew that without his personal intervention, this wasn't going to get resolved, and he was fully aware that nobody in the room was going to openly disagree. He then left the council to record a speech to the nation announcing the surrender for later broadcast. Upon hearing of the impending capitulation, those trying to stop it knew that they had to act. Now, this coup was technically in opposition to the Emperor's personal views, but it was justified as him being tricked by weak, treasonous advisors. They ordered their troops into the Imperial Palace and tried to convince Takeshi Mori, the head of the Imperial Guard, there to join them. He was promptly shot for refusing, and Hatanaka then faked an order from him telling the Imperial Guard to lock down the palace and find the recording. There were, however, some problems.
Wait,
from him
what?
telling the Imperial Guard to lock down the palace and find the recording.
He's wearing his skin.
There were, however, some problems.
That's not real.
Whilst they were able to occupy the palace, they couldn't find the Emperor or his recording. This was mostly because none of the lights were on because of air raids. The Emperor and his recordings were both in a bomb shelter under the palace, whereas the Prime Minister had been tipped off and successfully fled. When news of the coup got out, the high-ranking army officers around Tokyo quickly moved in to put it down. And with the rest of the army against them, it became clear that the coup had failed. They tried one last time getting War Minister Anami on board, but he was too busy offing himself to be of any help. Thus, the leaders
he decided just to end it.
Told that they were free to go, to do what was expected of soldiers that had acted dishonourably, an expectation that they would meet. Well, most of them at least anyway. With the coup over, the Emperor's broadcast confirming Japan's surrender to the Allies
They just offed themselves?
And soon afterwards, World War II was well and truly over. And the fate of the soon-to-be-occupied Japan lay in the hands of the Allied High Command, who would ultimately prove Shigenori Togo's predictions right to a degree. Japan was disarmed, but war crime prosecutions were much more lenient there than in Germany. And because getting rid of him would be far too hard, the Allies kept the Emperor on the throne. And so, if they had just said that, then a lot of trouble could have been avoided.
The fact that the Japanese war criminals had more lenient trials, or that the trials just weren't as bad as in Germany, is very annoying because the Japanese committed a lot of crimes. So yeah, the coup failed because there just weren't many people who were actually on board with the idea. And plenty of people who were part of the coup and not part of it just offed themselves, because apparently that's a thing they do in Japan. A bit weird, but hey, that's how they do it, so who am I to judge? I do find it kind of funny, though, how a lot of people seem to forget just how terrible the Japanese were and how many crimes they actually committed. Everyone knows what Germany did, but Japan, no, they just kind of didn't do anything. We don't remember any of that. At least I don't hear many people talk about all the Japanese war crimes. It's also kind of sad how Japan fell. You know, they were all about like kamikaze pilots, honor and shit, and nowadays Japan is just making a bunch of anime about 2D girls with big boobs and all the other weird shit they make. It's really sad, it's disappointing. How the mighty have fallen. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you want to see more reactions, check out this video right here. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.